The dust was the first thing he noticed and the last thing he forgot. It was a fine red powder that coated the world in a film of rust and regret. It settled on the unpainted planks of the cabin, worked its way into the cracks of his calloused hands, and lived in the back of his throat like a permanent thirst. Caleb shifted his weight, the familiar ache in his left hip announcing itself as a dull, grinding metronome counting out the slow seconds of his life. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, bleached sky, beaten down on the parched earth until mirages shimmered over the sagebrush, promising water where there was only heat and shimmering air. His world was small, contained by the distant, bruised purple line of the mountains and the immediate reality of his failing homestead. It was a world of one, and that was how he intended to keep it. He had built this solitude with the same grim determination he had used to build the cabin, plank by painful plank. Each nail driven home was a nail in the coffin of the man he used to be. The man whose hip had been whole, whose hands had been fast, whose name had carried weight in towns he now avoided. Now, his only companion was the silence, a living thing that breathed with the wind and watched him with 1,000 unseen eyes from the tall grasses. He was expecting a man. The letter, months old and softened by countless readings, had promised a strong back from a contact in the city. A worker, someone to help him shore up the irrigation ditch from the spring before the summer burned everything to a crisp. The letter had been signed with a flourish, mentioning only an M. Lee, a name that sounded sturdy and reliable. The wagon was a dark speck on the horizon for hours before it resolved into the creaking, lumbering thing that finally pulled up to his property line. The driver, a man whose face was a road map of every hardship the territory had to offer, spat a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the baked ground. He did not get down. He just jerked a thumb toward the back of the wagon. Caleb squinted against the glare, his hand resting near the worn handle of the pistol on his hip, a habit that had refused to die with the rest of his past. He had paid for passage and 3 months' wages in advance, a staggering sum that had emptied his meager savings. He needed this to work. He needed that strong back. What emerged from the wagon was not a strong back. It was a woman. She was small, delicate, and moved with a fluid grace that seemed entirely out of place in this land of sharp edges and brutal utility. She wore a dress of dark, travel-stained silk, the fabric a whisper of another world, a world of tea-houses and paper lanterns, not dust and desperation. Her face was pale, composed, her dark eyes taking in the heat-shimmering cabin, the broken fence line, the solitary man with the permanent scowl and the bad leg, and revealing nothing. This was not a worker. This was a mistake, a catastrophic, expensive mistake. She carried a single, small chest, which the driver unceremoniously dumped in the dust before cracking his whip and turning the wagon around without a word. She stood alone, a fragile figurine dropped into a landscape of raw survival. Caleb limped toward her, each step a testament to his frustration. The silence stretched between them, thick with the heat and the buzzing of unseen insects. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. She did not flinch, did not look away. She simply met his gaze, her own expression as unreadable as a placid lake. "There's been a mistake," he said. The words came out like rocks, rough and heavy. "I sent for a hired hand." The woman, M. Lee, he presumed, gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of her head. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear, carrying no accent he could place, just a precise, careful articulation. "There is no mistake. I am May Lee. I was sent to you." "Sent for what?" he growled, the anger coiling in his gut. He had been cheated. Some city slicker had taken his money and sent him this ornament. This is a workin' ranch, or it will be. It's no place for a woman. Her gaze flickered for a moment, a brief, unshielded glimpse of something. Disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. I was told, she said, her voice dropping even lower, that I was to be the wife of a prosperous landowner. The words hung in the air, more shocking than a gunshot. Wife. The concept was so alien, so utterly impossible that he could only stare at her. He looked at his broken-down cabin, his parched fields, his own reflection in her dark eyes. A man crippled in more ways than one. Prosperous landowner. The lie was so vast it was almost comical. He had been deceived, and so, it seemed, had she. She had been sent here as a bride, and from the grim set of her jaw he guessed it was not a journey she had chosen willingly. He saw it then. They were two sides of the same counterfeit coin, two strangers bound by a swindle, stranded together at the edge of the world. "Well, you were told wrong," he finally managed to say, the words tasting like ash. "There's nothing for you here." He wanted to tell her to leave, to go back where she came from, but the wagon was gone, a dwindling dust cloud on the horizon. The nearest town was a 2-day walk, and the sun was already beginning its slow, brutal descent. A storm was brewing in the west, the clouds piling up like great purple bruises on the skyline. They were trapped. The silence returned, heavier this time, filled with the weight of two ruined futures. The storm broke just after dusk, a sudden, violent unleashing of fury that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside the small cabin. Rain came down in solid, wind-driven sheets, hammering against the roof and finding every tiny crack in the chinking. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, a mournful, terrifying sound that rattled the single glass pane in the window. Caleb had given her the only cot, a grudging gesture of hospitality that felt more like an admission of defeat. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows that made the small space feel even more confining. He was intensely aware of her presence, a quiet, still point in the chaos. She had not spoken a word since their initial disastrous exchange. She had simply taken her small chest to the corner, sat on the cot, and folded her hands in her lap. A loud crack, followed by the sickening splintering of wood, made them both jolt. A section of the roof over the lean-to kitchen gave way, and a torrent of water cascaded onto the floor, dousing the banked embers in the hearth with a great hiss of steam. Cold, wet air flooded the cabin. Caleb swore, a low, vicious curse, and pushed himself to his feet. He grabbed an oilcloth tarp and limped toward the breach, his bad leg protesting every movement. The task was impossible for one man in the dark, in this deluge. He would have to wait until morning, and by then, half his meager supplies would be ruined. He expected her to cry, to shrink away in fear. He expected the helplessness he saw in every other woman he had ever known when faced with the raw, untamable power of the frontier. He was wrong. May was already on her feet, her movements swift and economical. She did not panic. She assessed. Her eyes darted from the gaping hole to the spreading pool of water, to the sacks of flour and beans now sitting in the encroaching puddle. Without a word to him, she moved. She dragged the heavy sacks of flour, one by one, to the dry side of the cabin. The effort was immense. He could see the strain in her slender frame, the taut lines of her shoulders, but she did not stop. She worked with a silent, focused intensity that stunned him. When the provisions were safe, she turned her attention to the rest of the cabin. She found his spare buckets and placed them under the worst of the new drips that had started. She took his sewing kit from a shelf, a tangled mess of thread and bent needles he rarely used, and with a few deft movements had a needle threaded. She took a spare shirt, tore it into strips, and began methodically stuffing the smaller cracks in the wall where the wind was driving the rain through. Her hands, which he had assumed were soft and useless, were quick and sure. Section. He stood there for a long moment, the useless tarp in his hands, watching her. In the flickering lamplight, she seemed transformed. She was no longer a delicate doll sent to the wrong address. She was a force of quiet competence, a study in resilience. He had judged her by the silk of her dress, not the steel of her spine. A pang of something he refused to name. Shame, perhaps, pricked at him. He was the capable one, the frontiersman. Yet she was the one saving his home from dissolving around them while he stood frozen by his own anger and assumptions. He finally moved, shaking himself from his stupor. "Here," he grunted, pushing the oilcloth toward her. "This will work better." She took it without looking at him, her attention already on the next problem. Together, in a tense, unspoken partnership, they worked to secure the cabin. He used his height and strength to brace the tarp over the largest hole, while she used her smaller size and agility to patch and redirect the invading water. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their movements fell into a rhythm, a dance of pure necessity. By the time the worst of the storm had passed, leaving a steady, drumming rain in its wake, the cabin was mostly dry. The fire was out, the air was cold, but their supplies were saved. May returned to her cot, her silk dress now soaked and mud-streaked. She wrung out the hem with a practical twist of her wrists and then sat, once again composed, her breathing the only sound in the room besides the rain. Caleb sank back into his chair at the table, his body aching with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the exhaustion she held so carefully at bay, the faint tremor in her hands that she tried to still by clasping them together. She was not weak, but she was alone and terrified, and trying desperately not to show it. He had been so consumed by his own misfortune that he had failed to see hers. He got up, stoked the embers in the main fireplace, and coaxed a small flame back to life. He put a pot of coffee on to boil, the familiar bitter aroma slowly filling the cold air. He did not own a second cup. He poured the steaming liquid into a tin bowl and set it on the small crate beside her cot. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Drink it," he said, his voice still rough, but lacking its earlier edge. "You'll catch your death." He turned his back before she could respond, pretending to busy himself with the fire. He felt her gaze on his back, a silent, questioning wait. A truce had been called, not with words, but with shared labor and a bowl of hot coffee in the dead of a stormy night. The world outside was a wreck, and their futures were a complete unknown. But for the first time since she had stepped out of that wagon, the suffocating solitude of the cabin had been broken. It was no longer just his space. It was theirs. The storm raged for 2 full days, imprisoning them in the damp, claustrophobic confines of the cabin. The rain eventually softened to a persistent drizzle, but the world outside was a morass of mud, the creek swollen to a brown, churning river that had swallowed the dirt track leading to town. There was no leaving. They existed in a bubble of shared silence, punctuated only by the necessary sounds of survival. The chop of an axe as Caleb split the last of the dry wood, the soft scrape of a knife as May peeled their meager supply of potatoes, the crackle of the fire. In this quiet, Caleb watched her. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to knowing every inch of his domain, and she was an unknown quantity, a disruption to his hardened routine. But as the hours bled into days, he saw a pattern emerge. She was methodical, efficient, and possessed a stillness that was not passive but deeply observant. She moved through his chaotic space and brought a subtle order to it. She washed his few dishes and stacked them neatly, something he had never bothered to do. She found a broken broom and, with a bit of twine, repaired it well enough to sweep the floor clean of the mud they tracked in. She took his mending basket, a hopeless tangle of ripped shirts and socks with holes, and began to work. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, a line of disciplined artistry against the coarse, faded fabric. He found himself mesmerized by her hands. They were not the hands of a pampered lady. They were deft and capable. When she cooked, she wasted nothing. She took the last of the potatoes, a handful of flour, and some wild onions she had spotted growing near the cabin door, and created a thin, savory stew that was more satisfying than anything he had eaten in months. She rationed their food with a careful eye, her brow furrowed in concentration as she calculated how long their supplies would last. She was not just surviving, she was managing. She was imposing her will on their desperate circumstances. His initial assessment of her as a fragile ornament felt more foolish with each passing hour. That silk dress, now hopelessly ruined, was a costume, a remnant of a life that was no longer hers. The woman wearing it was something else entirely. He began to see the strength in her quietness. It was not the absence of words, but the presence of thought. She would watch the landscape through the small window for long stretches, her expression unreadable, and he wondered what she was seeing. Was she seeing the same bleak, unforgiving emptiness that he saw, or did she see something more? On the third morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds. The light that filled the cabin felt tentative, hopeful. The air smelled clean, washed new. Caleb knew he had to assess the damage. The spring was the lifeblood of his claim. If the storm had altered its course or fouled it with mud, he was finished. He pulled on his boots, his hip groaning in protest at the damp cold. "I'm going to check the spring," he announced to the room. May looked up from her mending. She simply nodded, then returned to her work. He did not know what he had expected. A question? A plea not to be left alone? But she offered nothing, her self-possession as complete as ever. It was strangely unsettling. The walk to the spring was a struggle. The ground sucked at his boots, and his limp was more pronounced in the thick mud. The damage was worse than he had feared. A small landslide, loosened by the rain, had partially blocked the mouth of the spring. Rocks and a slurry of mud choked the flow of water to a mere trickle. The irrigation ditch he had spent months digging was now filled with debris. It would take him a week of back-breaking labor to clear it, a week he did not have. Despair, a cold and familiar companion, settled in his chest. He returned to the cabin hours later, covered in mud, his face a grim mask of defeat. He did not have to say a word. May took one look at him, and her eyes went to the empty water buckets. She stood up, took off the apron she had fashioned from a clean flour sack, and walked to the door. "Show me," she said. It was not a question, but a quiet command. He was too tired and disheartened to argue. He led her back to the spring, his heavy steps a contrast to her light, careful tread as she navigated the treacherous ground. She surveyed the scene, her gaze sharp and analytical. She walked the perimeter of the landslide, her eyes tracing the path of the water, the angle of the fallen rocks. He expected her to state the obvious to confirm their ruin, Instead, she pointed to a large boulder perched precariously above the slide. "That rock," she said. "If it could be moved, it would clear the worst of the blockage." "It would take 3 men and a team of oxen to move that rock," he said, the bitterness sharp in his voice. "I have neither." She ignored his tone. "You have a shovel," she stated, "and a pry bar, and rope." She looked at him, her dark eyes intense. "And you have 2 hands. I have 2 hands." He stared at her, dumbfounded. The idea was absurd. It was dangerous. But as he looked at where she was pointing, he saw the logic in it. She had not seen an immovable obstacle. She had seen a problem of leverage and physics. She had seen a solution where he had only seen failure. For the second time since her arrival, Caleb felt a profound sense of having underestimated the woman standing before him. The fragile bride, sent as punishment, was now proposing to move a mountain, and in the clear, determined light of her eyes he found, to his own astonishment, a flicker of something he had not felt in years: hope. The journey to town was a necessity they could no longer postpone. Their supplies were critically low, and Caleb needed to register the storm damage at the land office, a formality that felt like another nail in his homestead's coffin. The mud had dried to a cracked, hard pan, and the 2-day walk stretched before them like a penance. They moved in their now customary silence. Caleb set in a slow, limping pace, and May following a few steps behind, her stride surprisingly steady and untiring. She had fashioned a pair of rough shoes from a piece of discarded leather and wore one of his old, oversized shirts over her dress. She looked less like a bride and more like a pilgrim, a refugee from a forgotten world. The town of Redemption was a single, dusty street, lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that had aspirations of grandeur but had settled for mere existence. It was a town of whispers and sideways glances. As they walked down the main street, a hush fell over the saloons and the general store. Faces appeared in windows, conversations died in throats. Caleb was a known quantity here, the broken gunslinger who had tried to go straight, a man best left alone. But the sight of him with a small Chinese woman at his side was a spectacle. The town's collective gaze was a physical weight, a mixture of raw curiosity and thinly veiled hostility. They were not just strangers. They were an affront to the town's harsh, simple order. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and unspoken judgment. The proprietor, a man with a perpetually sour expression, served Caleb while pointedly ignoring May, as if she were a ghost. As Caleb counted out his coins for flour and salt, the door swung open, and a shadow fell across the room. Silas Blackwood entered the store as if he owned it, which, in a practical sense, he did. He was a big man, florid and fleshy, dressed in a tailored suit that strained at the seams. He owned the largest ranch in the territory, controlled the water rights for miles around, all except for the small, stubborn spring on Caleb's land. Blackwood's eyes, small and predatory, landed on Caleb and then slid to May, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, well, Caleb," Blackwood boomed, his voice filling the small store. "I heard you had company. Didn't realize you'd stooped to ordering your women from the catalog." A few of the loungers by the stove snickered. Caleb's hand instinctively went to his hip, his knuckles brushing the worn leather of his holster. He said nothing, his face a mask of cold stone. He knew that reacting was exactly what Blackwood wanted. Blackwood took a step closer, his presence crowding the room. "I hear the storm hit you hard. Must be difficult trying to scratch a living out of that rock pile with a bad leg." He gestured dismissively at May. "And now you've got another mouth to feed, a fancy one at that." He turned his attention fully to May, looking her up and down with an insolent appraisal that made Caleb's blood run cold. "You know, little lady, you hitched your wagon to the wrong horse. That deed of his isn't worth the paper it's printed on. A smart woman would know when to cut her losses." May met his gaze without flinching. Her expression was perfectly neutral, her posture erect and dignified. She did not speak, but her silence was more powerful than any retort. It was a wall of serene indifference that Blackwood's bluster could not breach. Her refusal to be intimidated seemed to infuriate him more than any defiance could have. He turned back to Caleb, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I've made you a fair offer for that land, Caleb. That offer is still on the table for now, but my patience is wearing thin. You're sitting on my water, and I aim to have it. Sell to me before you find yourself with nothing at all. Think about what's best for your family." He spat the last word like a curse. With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the store, his 2 ever-present hired guns falling into step behind him. The tension in the room broke, and the whispers resumed, more venomous now. Caleb gathered his meager supplies, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He could feel the eyes of the town on them, judging him, dismissing her. The threat had been made public. Blackwood had not just challenged his claim to the land, he had challenged his ability to protect what was his. And in this brutal world, a man who could not protect his own was as good as dead. As they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the threat hung between them, a poison in the air. This was no longer just a struggle against the land. It was a struggle against the greed of a man who believed the world belonged to him, and they were standing in his way. The threat did not take long to manifest. It began not with fire or guns, but with water, the most precious currency in this arid land. A few days after their return from town, Caleb noticed the flow from the spring diminishing. He followed the creek bed up into the rocky hills that marked the border of his property and found what he had expected. A crudely built dam of rocks and mud had been erected just inside Blackwood's property line, diverting a significant portion of the water into a dry gully. It was a petty, vindictive act designed to slowly choke his land to death. Caleb spent a day undoing their work, his body screaming in protest as he heaved rocks and shoveled mud, his bad leg a constant throbbing agony. He knew it was a temporary fix. They would be back. This was just the first move in a game he could not afford to lose. That night, he cleaned his rifle and his pistol with a slow, deliberate care, the familiar scent of gun oil and worn steel a grim comfort. The peace of his solitude had been shattered, replaced by the tense watchfulness of a man under siege. He did not sleep. He sat in his chair by the door, the rifle across his lap, and watched the moon-drenched landscape. May, sensing the shift in him, was also awake. She sat at the table, mending a shirt under the soft glow of the lantern, her rhythmic stitching a small, steady sound in the taut silence. She had not asked what was wrong. She did not need to. She had seen the dam, had understood its meaning as clearly as he did. The attack came a week later, just before dawn. It started with the smell of smoke, sharp and acrid on the morning air. Caleb was out of the cabin in an instant, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A line of fire was eating its way through the dry grass at the northern edge of his property, pushed toward the cabin by a steady breeze. It was not a large fire, not yet, but it was deliberate. It was a message. He grabbed buckets, his mind racing. The creek was too far. The well was his only hope. He began the grueling process of hauling water, his movements clumsy with urgency. He could see riders on the ridge, small, dark silhouettes against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. Blackwood's men. They were not trying to burn him out completely, just to terrorize him, to show him how vulnerable he was. May was right behind him, a second bucket in her hands. She was surprisingly strong, her movements efficient, wasting no motion. They worked as a team, a frantic, desperate ballet of filling, carrying, and dousing. The smoke stung their eyes and choked their lungs. The heat was a physical blow. But they did not stop. They fought the fire with a silent, synchronized fury. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they finally beat the fire back, leaving a blackened, smoking scar on the land. They stood side by side, panting, covered in soot and sweat, their faces grim. The riders on the ridge watched for a moment longer, then wheeled their horses and disappeared. The immediate danger was over, but the larger threat remained. Caleb sank to the ground, his leg given out from under him. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a cold, simmering rage. They had come onto his land. They had tried to burn him out. This was an escalation he could not ignore. "They'll be back," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "Next time, they won't be content to just scare us." May stood over him, her expression unreadable. She looked at the blackened earth, then at the distant ridge where the men had been. She seemed to be calculating, her mind working behind the calm facade of her face. "Your cabin is poorly positioned for defense," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The windows face the wrong way. There is no clear field of fire toward the main approach. The wood store creates a blind spot." Caleb stared up at her, momentarily forgetting his anger. Her assessment was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly accurate. It was the kind of tactical analysis a seasoned soldier would make, not a mail-order bride from a distant land. He had built the cabin for shelter from the elements, not for a firefight. He had been a fool. "They will likely approach from the rocks to the west," she continued, her gaze sweeping the landscape. "It offers the best cover. If you were to move that pile of old lumber to the edge of the clearing, it would create a barricade. It would force them into the open." She looked at him, her dark eyes holding his. "We must be prepared. We cannot just wait for them to act." In that moment, the last of his preconceptions about her crumbled to dust. This was not a partnership of convenience or necessity anymore. It was a partnership for survival. Her calm, logical mind was a weapon as potent as his rifle. He had been so focused on his own strength, his own past, that he had failed to see the formidable ally who had been by his side all along. He had thought he was protecting her, but the truth was they would have to protect each other. He pushed himself to his feet, the pain in his leg a distant, unimportant thing. "All right," he said, his voice filled with a new, grim resolve. "Let's get to work." The final confrontation came not with a warning, but with the sudden sharp crack of a rifle shot that splintered the door frame just inches from Caleb's head. He threw himself to the floor, pulling May down with him, his own pistol already in his hand. The siege had begun. Through the window, he could see them. Blackwood himself, flanked by at least half a dozen men, using the rocky outcrops for cover, just as May had predicted. "Stay down!" he yelled, crawling toward the barricade of lumber they had built by the front window. The small cabin, once his sanctuary, was now a trap. But it was a trap they had prepared. May was already at the back of the cabin, a second rifle, Caleb's old, spare one, in her hands. She was not aiming it, but methodically laying out ammunition on a small, clean cloth, her hands steady, her face a mask of intense concentration. She was his quartermaster, the calm center of the storm. Another shot punched through the wall, sending splinters flying. "Caleb!" Blackwood's voice roared from outside, distorted by the wind. "This is your last chance. Walk out of there and leave the deed on the table, or we'll burn you out and take it from your corpse." Caleb fired back, a single, carefully aimed shot that sent one of the men scrambling for better cover. He was a good shot, even now, but he was outnumbered, and his immobility was a crippling disadvantage. He could not move, could not flank them. He could only hold this position and hope their ammunition ran out before his did. The fight fell into a deadly rhythm, a barrage of shots from outside, followed by Caleb's measured, precise returns. He fought with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before, his past rising up to serve him one last time. But they were relentless, chipping away at the cabin's meager defenses, the bullets thudding into the logs like a deadly drumbeat. During a lull in the shooting, as Caleb reloaded, Blackwood's voice came again, dripping with smug triumph. "You're a fool, Caleb. Fighting for a piece of paper that isn't even valid? I had the territorial surveyor in my pocket years ago. Your claim is based on a faulty survey line. The spring has always been on my land, legally speaking. You're dying for nothing." The words hit Caleb harder than any bullet. The foundation of his life here, the single thing he had worked for, was a lie. A wave of black despair washed over him. All this struggle, all this pain, for a fraud. He felt his resolve begin to crumble. It was then that May spoke, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, clear and sharp as glass. "He is mistaken." Caleb turned to look at her. She had moved from the back wall and was now crouched beside him, her face pale but her eyes blazing with an intensity he had never seen before. In her hand, she held the worn, folded papers of his land deed. "I have read your documents," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And I have read the territorial charter you keep with them. My family were merchants. I was taught contract law and accounting to protect our interests." She tapped a specific line on the deed with her finger. "The survey is indeed faulty, but he is wrong about the consequence. According to Territorial Statute 7, Section 4, any claim filed and improved upon for a period of more than 2 years, with no legal challenge filed within that time, defaults to the homesteader, regardless of subsequent survey disputes. The doctrine is called adverse possession. You have been here for 3 years. His time to challenge the survey has expired. The law is on your side. This land and the spring are yours." The world tilted on its axis. He stared at her, at the quiet, unassuming woman who had just dismantled Blackwood's entire argument with a few calm sentences. The woman he had mistaken for a helpless liability held the key to his salvation not in a gun, but in her mind. The lie was not his deed, but Blackwood's claim. A surge of renewed strength, of righteous fury, coursed through him. He was not a trespasser. He was a man defending his home. Just then, a bullet tore through the barricade, catching him in the shoulder. The impact threw him back, a searing, white-hot pain exploding in his arm. He dropped his rifle. Before he could even register what had happened, May was moving. She did not scream. She did not panic. She grabbed his fallen pistol from its holster, her small hand surprisingly steady as she took aim through the window. She fired once. A cry of pain from outside told him she had hit her mark. It was not a killing shot, but it was enough. She had bought them a moment. The sound of approaching horses, fast and heavy, made them both freeze. For a heart-stopping second, Caleb thought Blackwood had brought reinforcements. But the voice that cut through the air was not Blackwood's. "Silas Blackwood, this is Sheriff Brody. Lay down your arms." The sheriff. Someone must have ridden from town after hearing the shots. The tide had turned. Blackwood's men, already unnerved by the fierce resistance and the wounding of their companion, had no desire to face down the law. They began to scatter, melting back into the rocks. Enraged, his victory slipping through his fingers, Blackwood made one last desperate play. He charged the cabin, his face a mask of the purple fury, his own pistol raised. He burst through the weakened door, ready to end it. Caleb, struggling to sit up, his vision blurring from the pain, knew he was too slow, but May was faster. She moved between them, a small, unyielding shield. She did not have a weapon, only the legal papers still clutched in her hand. She held them up. "It is over, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with unshakable authority. "Your claim is invalid under the law." Her absolute certainty, her utter lack of fear, seemed to stun him more than a weapon could have. In that moment of hesitation, Caleb, with a final, agonizing effort, lunged, sweeping Blackwood's legs out from under him. The big man crashed to the floor, his gun skittering away into a corner. The fight was over. Sheriff Brody and his deputy filled the doorway, their guns drawn. They took in the scene, the wounded Caleb, the defiant May, the vanquished Blackwood on the floor. Silence descended, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. May knelt beside him, her composure finally cracking as she saw the blood soaking his shirt. Her hands trembled as she reached out, gently probing the wound. He looked up at her, past the pain, past the chaos, and saw her. He saw the brilliant mind, the unshakable courage, the fierce loyalty of the woman who had saved him in every way a man could be saved. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze a new understanding was forged, silent and profound, in the quiet aftermath of the storm. Weeks bled into a month, and a fragile peace settled over the homestead. The land, which had been a battlefield, began to heal. New grass, green and tender, grew over the blackened scar left by the fire. The spring, now flowing freely and undisputed, gurgled with a sound that was almost cheerful. Under the weight of May's legally sound testimony, delivered to a territorial judge with quiet, irrefutable precision, Silas Blackwood's empire of intimidation had crumbled. His land claims were under review, and he was facing charges that would keep him occupied for years. The town of Redemption, once a gallery of suspicious stares, now looked upon Caleb and May with a kind of grudging awe. The story of the quiet Chinese woman who had faced down a tyrant with a law book had become a local legend. The cabin was changing too. On the west side, a new room was taking shape. Caleb worked on it every day, his shoulder now healed to a dull ache, barely slowing him down. He moved with a purpose he had not felt in years, the rhythmic strike of his hammer, a steady, hopeful beat. He was no longer just shoring up a defense against the world. He was building a future. The oppressive silence that had once filled the small home had been replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the small sounds of two people sharing a life. May had claimed a patch of earth near the front door, a plot that had grown nothing but stubborn weeds. With the same methodical determination she applied to everything, she had tilled the soil, her hands protected by rough work gloves Caleb had bought for her in town. She was planting a garden, Not just the practical herbs and onions she had started with, but rows of beans, squash, and corn. She worked the earth with a gentle reverence, a creator coaxing life from the stubborn dirt. Sometimes Caleb would pause in his work and just watch her, a small figure kneeling in the vast landscape, her presence a quiet anchor that held his world in place. They still spoke little, but their communication had evolved beyond the need for words. A shared look across the dinner table, the simple act of him fetching a bucket of water for her garden without being asked, her leaving a cool cup of water for him on the lumber pile where he worked. These small gestures were a language all their own. They moved around each other with a fluid, unconscious grace, their separate lives braided into a single, strong cord. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold, they sat together on the newly built porch. The frame of the new room stood like a skeleton behind them, a promise of what was to come. A cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of sage and clean earth. May held a warm mug of tea in her hands, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Caleb sat beside her, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. He had spent so many years locked inside himself, a prisoner of his past and his pain. He had believed that solitude was his only shield. May had walked into his fortress of isolation, not with a battering ram, but with a quiet, persistent strength that had dismantled his walls brick by brick without him even realizing it. She had shown him that true strength was not about self-reliance, but about shared burdens. She had seen him not as a cripple or a washed-up gunslinger, but as a man worthy of defending. She had asked for nothing, but had given him everything. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the evening stillness. He looked out at the land, at the darkening fields and the sturdy cabin. It was not a grand estate. It was not the prosperous life she had been promised. It was a hard, simple existence, a life of endless work and small victories. But it was real, and it was theirs. "The arrangement," he began, his voice rough with disuse, "the one that brought you here. It was a lie, for both of us." May turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last of the fading light. She waited. "You don't have to stay," he said, the words costing him more than he would ever admit. "When the new room is finished, it can be yours. I can take you to the city, find you passage back to where you came from. You deserve more than this." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. He braced himself for her answer, for the inevitable nod, the quiet acceptance of his offer. He had to make it. It was the only honorable thing to do. "I was sent here as a punishment," she said softly, her voice carrying on the breeze, "for to find my family, for refusing a life that was chosen for me." She looked away from him, back toward her small burgeoning garden. "They sent me to this place thinking it was the end of the world, a barren wasteland where I would be forgotten." A small, sad smile touched her lips. In a way, they were right. She turned back to him, and the smile became something new, something genuine and full of light. But they were also wrong. She reached out, her small, work-roughened hand gently covering his own where it rested on the wooden bench. Her touch was a jolt, a current of warmth that went straight to his heart. "I am not a prisoner here, Caleb," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I have never been more free." She looked from his face to the house, to the land stretching out before them. "You asked me to show you the spring, and we cleared it. You asked me to help you fight, and we defended our home. You're building a new room, and I am planting a garden." Her grip on his hand tightened slightly. "This is not the life I was promised," she said. "It is the life we have built, together." She held his gaze, her dark eyes full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I am not going anywhere. This is our home now." He looked down at her hand covering his, a perfect fit. The words he had never been able to say, the feelings he had kept locked away for a lifetime, rose in his throat. But they were not needed. She already knew. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. It was not a grand declaration. It was a simple, profound truth. A commitment made not with flowery vows, but with shared silence, calloused hands, and the quiet promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. Together, they watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains, and for the first time in a very long time, Caleb was not afraid of the dark.